Dr. Ann Trudel, our guest, she's a physicist. She works at Triumph at UBC, and Triumph is a collaboration between UBC, UVic.
UBC, UVic, and University of Alberta originally. That's what Triumph stands for, Tri-University Maison Facility. But now we have 10 member universities that are part of the joint venture.
And its purpose is to study nuclear medicine and nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, or what?
Its purpose is to study nuclear physics, the properties of subatomic physics.
Okay.
So that's nuclear and particle physics. But of course, one of the benefits of that research is that in using cyclotrons to accelerate the beam to a high energy to be able to do that research, we also have been able to design cyclotrons to produce medical isotopes. And so we produce at Triumph with our lower energy cyclotrons 2 million patient doses of radioactivity annually. So, you know, there's a direct benefit to all of society from that nuclear research.
So that's the positive part.
That's correct.
Yes, a nuclear submarine.
Yes, a nuclear submarine.
Should we be worried about that or not? Or a ship fueled by nuclear?
Well, that's, you know, we've got essentially a light water reactor on board, is the way the American nuclear subs work. And I'm not that familiar with the, but I mean, it's my understanding would be that it's certainly a much smaller reactor, very much smaller than when you talk about nuclear power plants that are gigawatts.
But the mere word nuclear, you think nuclear, nuke weapons.
Yes.
War.
Right. So, of course, the thing with nuclear weapons is, you know, essentially the problem with having nuclear power comes down to safeguarding the nuclear fuel, the nuclear material, and the concern with if that breaks down, if you can't safeguard it adequately, then you risk someone using that material as a dirty bomb, say. I think that's the biggest concern.
What about someone working in a plant, in a nuclear power plant? Is it radioactive by the mere fact it exists, or is that contained always?
Oh, it's extremely controlled, and there are some areas where some workers need to go occasionally for maintenance work where the dose rates would be higher. But of course we monitor personnel doses, and we have regulatory limits that we need to meet. And so certainly that is, there are no issues in terms of occupational health and safety that aren't being met.
Can the world trust the regulators? Who is regulating where? Are there regulators in the United States and Canada, regulators in India, regulators in France? And who are they, and what are they watching?
It's true that each country has their own regulatory commission, their own nuclear regulators, and I think Canada's nuclear regulators, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, is completely independent of the power producers. Whereas I think in one of the problems in Japan is that the arm of the government that did the regulating was also the arm of the government that was looking after the producers and working with them. So a conflict of interest in terms of the regulators.
And that's probably not the only place that is happening.
Possibly,
don't know.
Yeah.
Speculating again, but the pros and cons of a nuclear power plant here.
Well, you mean here in BC?
Yes.
I mean, we have nuclear power plants in Canada are largely in Ontario. Quebec has a couple of nuclear plants or nuclear reactors, and New Brunswick as well. 50% of Ontario's power comes from nuclear. And in total for Canada, that represents about 15% of the total power generated in Canada. In BC, it's really difficult to see why we would even go with a nuclear power plant. I mean, we've got a lot of hydroelectric. That's right. And well, you know, there are of course the environmental impacts from the hydroelectric power that need to be looked at. And I think that's what we need to do in the long run in terms of looking at nuclear, looking at all of the different possible ways of generating power, is what are the costs, social, economic, health, environmental costs, and really weighing those.
And if the world decides nuclear not a good option, just not, What would change tomorrow or the next day or 2 years from now? I know that's speculating again.
It is, and even with Germany making the decision to go ahead with phasing out nuclear, I mean, they're talking about, I think it's 2022, so you know, we've got another 12 years before we get there. So it's not going to happen overnight, but I think the bottom line is that we end up with higher CO2 emissions.
Right.
I mean,
which we don't want.
Which we don't want. So I think the first thing we need to do is look at, first of all, can we reduce our energy consumption? You know, what more can we do in terms of being more economical?
Reduce, reuse, recycle.
Exactly.
Rethink
As well. And then when we say rethink in terms of the different ways of generating power, we need to look at the whole picture. And, you know, everybody talks about solar and wind, and it's just recently, in fact, that we were able to reach the break-even point with solar power in terms of the energy required to generate a photovoltaic cell and the energy that it will produce over its lifetime. We've just now reached that break-even point where we generate as much energy from it as it takes to manufacture it. Yeah.
So solar panels an option, certainly.
Solar panels are an option. I mean, I don't think they'll ever be a significant fraction. I mean, I think right now they're on the order of 1%, perhaps, in some countries where they've invested heavily.
But as the world runs out of cheap oil,
yes,
that's an issue. That's in there.
That is.
Should plants that are aging be dismantled, or can they just be fixed?
That's something I think that we'll look at more closely, especially in light of Fukushima. I mean, you know, in some ways, you know, it was unfortunate. The plants that were impacted at Fukushima were essentially within a year or two of being dismantled or refurbished in terms of upgrades.
Right.
And certainly we need to look at that. You know, one of the things, for instance, with the nuclear fuel that led to the hydrogen gas production was that zirconium cladding that's used on the outside of the fuel bundles is essentially what gave rise to the hydrogen gas. And certainly, like in our CANDU reactors, we have a much more stable ceramic that's used that can withstand higher temperatures. So those are the kinds of, when we say refurbishments, upgrades that can be looked at and considered in terms of making
sooner rather than later. And the most modern nuclear plant now probably takes all that into consideration, probably.
Correct.
I know that this sounds silly, but in an earthquake zone, a place like this, where they say it's just a matter of years or perhaps months or days before we have the big earthquake, it makes no sense to me for us to have nuclear power.
Well, you certainly wouldn't want to put it on a fault zone. Yes.
Well, that's what I'm thinking.
And
we don't know what Mother Nature is going to do because we have tornadoes in Massachusetts or something. So,
but if we look at the nuclear power plants where they are in Ontario, I mean, certainly, you know, you're not talking about, you know, I mean, the kind of magnitude quakes that they look at there are a 6 or 7. Those were the aftershocks, essentially, in Japan. And you're not going to have the tidal wave issue that we had in Japan as well. One of the things that came out of Fukushima very early on, in fact, the Canadian regulator asked all the nuclear power plants in Canada to re-examine their worst case scenarios in terms of compound natural disasters. So that's has certainly been looked at now, and there may be more that comes out in terms of ensuring mitigation measures, perhaps having backup generators available for power plants, and ensuring enough redundancy also in terms of backup generators. So, yeah.
So interesting. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Fanny.
Thank you for taking the time. Dr. Ann Trudel from Triumph at UBC.